Hello, my name is Peter Zablocki, and I'm a historian, author, and college professor. I'm thrilled to invite you to check out Evergreen Network's History Shorts podcast. Every Tuesday and Thursday, join me on a journey through time, exploring the little-known and hidden gems of history. In each bite-sized episode, I'll dive into my original research to bring you intriguing historical curiosities you've probably never heard of, uncovering the fascinating stories that have shaped our world, from forgotten figures to overlooked events. And the best part? I've condensed all this historical goodness into manageable chunks, perfect for your on-the-go lifestyle. Whether you're commuting to work or squeezing in a quick break, History Shorts fits into the little time you probably think you don't have. Subscribe now and never miss an episode of the History Shorts podcast, available wherever you get your podcasts. This is Peter.
And this is Tom.
And you're listening to History Teachers Talking Podcast,
part of the Evergreen Podcast Network.
All right, this is Peter Zablocki and Thomas Reska, and welcome back to our podcast. I think this one we should have done 4 years ago.
Well, it's surprising that we didn't touch on this, although some of the events we'll be talking about in this podcast we definitely touched on before. And so if you wanted more deep dives, there's definitely other ones available. But yeah, today we're going to look at probably the history film, I would say, right? Like
I agree.
It's always like towards the end of the year or just certain parts, or one, even if you mention, even students, even today, I'll say they still watch it or at least are aware of it because it's become such a cultural phenomenon. So the movie that we're going to be talking about, not reviewing, just talking about the history in it, is Forrest Gump, which was it's an incredibly popular movie when it came out in 1994, and it was based, I think, the same name, based on a 1986 novel of the same name. Yep. It really kind of recounts a lot of Americana, that's the best way to put it, major events from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and that this one man basically just encounters through his life. It's not factual. The events really happen, but there was no actual Forrest Gump. Although I'm sure after the movie was made, people probably did name their kids Forrest Gump.
Right. I mean, I've had students named Forrest. I'm trying to think about it. Like, when did I have these students named Forrest? And I have a feeling they probably were born after 94. So this movie came out in 1994. It's directed by Robert Zemeckis. It is, as you mentioned, the movie that I think every history teacher, literally every history teacher that I know, if you teach U.S. history, shows this movie at the end of the school year. And it's almost like the students, as you mentioned, they know this. Even like my son's generation, because we introduced them to it. And I think parents introduce their children to it because it's so important, significantly culturally important to American history and culture, that it's almost like I feel like a lot of people probably learned about American history's events just from this movie, which is why, as you mentioned, they mistakenly think like, oh, Forrest was there. Like Forrest, is the reason that Watergate was figured out. Like,
not quite. Well, what it was is, I think at this time too, Pete, is that a lot of when this movie first came out in 94, a lot of parents were maybe going to see it. About the older adults, I would say that.
Yeah, it was nostalgia for them. Yeah.
They lived through a lot of these events also.
Yeah.
They lived through the moon landing, JFK being shot and stuff like that. So they kind of remembered it. So if they ever do make a sequel or something newer like it today, which I know they're never making a Forrest Gump sequel, apparently that was kibosh, which we can talk about why that happened later on. But it would be the same thing, like just showing those, like, it's a movie that still resonates today, without a doubt.
Yep. 100%. So let's kind of just go right into it. We're not going to be talking per se about a movie because I just want to quote Forrest. Like, every time I watch that movie at the end of the school year, and my wife's like, "Oh, you're watching Forrest Gump, aren't you?" And I'm like, "Yeah," because I just quote Forrest for like the entire month of June. But let's not do that. Let's start off with the first historical context in Forrest Gump, which I think starts really when he kind of begins his story, and that's with his name itself.
His name himself, yes.
Right. So this is the kind of controversial in this sense. And today it's the one thing that people say when they look back at the movie, they're like, maybe some more time should have been spent on this. But he is named after Nathan Bedford Forrest, extremely controversial figure in American history, particularly known for his involvement in the Confederate Army during the American Civil War. However, even more so known because he was the first ever Grand Wizard of the KKK.
Of the Ku Klux Klan, yeah.
Yes, very active in the early years. So Nathan Bedford Forrest eventually distances himself from the organization, and his association with the Klan remains very much like an aspect of his legacy, though. Like, he can't escape that.
You go down history as someone who creates
The
the
first,
KKK. Yeah,
yeah,
like
right.
that's going to be your legacy, whether you want it to or not.
Yep. I mean, it's interesting that he does distance himself from it at the end, but to this day, extremely controversial figure. And Forrest brings that in with the idea that his mom names him that to show that people sometimes do stupid things and make stupid mistakes. Like that's how Forrest explains it. And today, in our new 21st century culture, some people are like, well, that's not enough. He didn't bring up what Nathan Bedford Forrest did, but I think it's implied. If you know your history of what Nathan Forrest Bedford Forrest did. To this day, opinions about Forrest vary widely. Some actually still regard him as a hero, but then again, our society is still slightly
Yeah, but
flawed.
he's one of those people, like I said, he was a Confederate general, so they're not putting statues up anywhere.
Oh, no, 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 not of
You're
this
not going to
guy.
see that sort, especially, like I said, it's whatever he does later on, his legacy is still always going to be somewhat that he was a grand wizard
Started
of
a
the Ku
KKK.
Klux Klan. Yeah, that's part of it.
100%.
Not escaping that, nor should he.
No, should he? Absolutely. So right after this, again, we kind of go right into Forrest being a young kid. He's grown up with his mom in Alabama, and I think the next real historical reference here is Elvis Presley. Correct?
Yeah, it's got to be Elvis Presley and rock and roll. So basically, you've seen the movie, but his mom's renting out a room, I guess, right?
Yep.
And then Elvis is staying there. He just kind of says he's like a musician, a really nice musician guy or whatever. And supposedly, as he's there. Forrest is kind of listening to a Hound Dog, an early version of Hound Dog, and then he
Yep.
starts dancing because he's in those leg braces. That's kind of showing like the dance moves that he's going to see later on in 1956 when on the Milton Berle show when Elvis Presley performs. It's kind of like introduces him to the world a lot of ways. With Elvis, it was a lot more than just the music that was important. It was also like the
Yep.
show, like the intensity, whatever you want to call it. It was more than just the music. That like it was obviously his sex appeal and just his like rebellious nature and stuff like that. But the '56, you take everything going on like Taylor Swift and stuff like that and multiply that by 100. That was probably Elvis Presley in the
Yeah.
'50s.
Yeah, I would
Without
say
a doubt.
so. And what a few things here that you mentioned, I want to kind of expand on. One, the primary controversy surrounding Elvis Presley was his appropriation of African American music, right? Rhythm and blues, gospel music, and they
Yeah,
said that
put them
he
all
kind of
together.
brought that into his own rock and roll music. And critics accused him initially of stealing black music and profiting from it, without giving real credit to the original artist, like the idea of the Hound Dog, right, being a song that was written before that. And some others, I guess, argue that Elvis helped popularize African American music styles among white audiences, which is probably what brought him to such
The
fame, you might
mainstream, yeah.
say.
Well,
Yeah,
that in TV, like he was already kind of famous. Like Heartbreak Hotel was out on the radio, so people knew who he was. But it wasn't until he was on TV and actually people saw him dancing because it was, he gyrated his hips. That was a
that's what it was. Yep.
big thing in the
Right.
1950s. Like
Yeah.
you're talking about like Britney Spears or I guess Taylor Swift. I don't even know what Taylor Swift does.
Well, no,
Well,
but like
she's
imagine
just
like Britney, like
well,
not even
it
Britney Spears. Like think of like
was a
Miley
big deal.
Cyrus. Think of Miley Cyrus on like the Wrecking Ball naked. Like, and imagine back then they thought it was so provocative because he gyrated his dance moves, his hips, right? They're like, oh my god, this is so highly sexualized. They said his inhibited style of performing and his hip shaking were so suggestive that it actually offended and shocked specifically conservative segments of society. And people were like, you are promoting immoral behavior. You're corrupting our youth. And the premise here is that he learned these dance moves supposedly from Forrest, right? Because Forrest couldn't dance right or correctly
Yeah,
because of his leg
and
braces.
yeah, in real life they think he was just trying to stop a nervous like shaking of his leg, and that was maybe why he was
Yep.
doing it. But anyway, like we
Yeah.
said, the
Oh, yeah.
movie is not historical fact.
Indeed. But it's kind of cool how he brings that in. All right. Cool
Oh,
stuff.
absolutely,
What,
absolutely.
so what is your next one? Because my next one was JFK visit, but do you have
Well,
anything
no,
before that?
yeah, I saw. Well, there was a couple other ones that I was able to kind of like look at that I thought were interesting. So one like dynamic about the whole movie is from the 1950s. The idea of the nuclear family, right? The mom, the dad,
True.
and the two kids, and then Forrest and the other main character Jenny. They're like exceptions to this, right?
That is true.
Forrest
Yep.
is a single. Forrest is the product of a single mother, which was like scandalous back then. And then Jenny has a mother, but also an alcoholic father. So it's not that like Norman Rockwell, Leave It to Beaver, perfect little family type of scenario. So it's kind of like showing like even though there was like this picture perfect thing, that wasn't for everybody. Obviously, it wasn't what everyone had, and that's going to lead to like the rebellious or nature of like the 60s and 70s that not everyone had that picturesque 1950s life, you know? You see the Confederate flag a lot, obviously, early on. But another one that I thought was interesting was when he played football. This kind of goes like before he meets JFK.
That is
And
true.
that was
Yep.
Bear Bryant. So remember, Forrest is from Alabama, the University of Alabama, which is notoriously unsegregated during this time.
Yep.
And they actually show later on in a, well, they don't show here. They think they do show like his team winning, but later on, Alabama actually lost in a championship game in 1970, 42-21 to USC. And what happened was basically all the touchdowns were scored by African American players. And what it said later on is that USC, that loss to UFC, did more to integrate Alabama in about 20 minutes than it took MLK 20 years to do. Because as soon as people in Alabama saw how like good African American players could be at football, or how much better a team could be if you had that, you know, let everybody play, they were just like, oh, we have to start letting everybody play because we need to win our championships.
That's a great story. And it also totally funnels into, because that was my thing I was going to say about the visit with Kennedy, because technically there was no real visits back then. During JFK's administration, it was not a regular practice for college football teams to visit the White House. However, there were a couple instances where college football teams did go to the White House. They were invited by President Kennedy. And one of them, one notable one, actually occurred in 1962 when the University of Alabama football team, as you mentioned, coached by Paul Bear Bryant, was invited to the White House to meet President Kennedy because Alabama had just won the national championship. So this is the whole this was the whole premise of why Forrest wound up being there. And the visit to the White House was of recognition of their achievement. This meeting is particularly significant because it took place during a period of like racial tension, right? And they had just recently, Alabama had just recently integrated its football team and enrolled its first ever African American player, Vivian Malone. And that's why it was so important that like they went for that visit because they had just enrolled the first African American player to,
Well, remember
onto their
this,
team.
yeah. What's going on during this time too is you have George Wallace, right, when he's standing in that schoolhouse door,
And
not letting,
actually, and you know what
yeah.
he's doing, right? He's actually trying to prevent Vivian Malone from registering among him and one other person. So you want to get into
I
that
think.
one?
Well, I think that's
Is,
actually
right?
shown on the TV, right? Like, isn't
Yep.
as far as there, or is he seeing on TV? I don't remember.
No,
Fully.
Forrest is there, and then his coach sees him on the TV, like being there. Because
That's
Forrest,
right.
remember,
Yeah.
he like picks up a notebook by one of the
He
students
just
that
kind of
drops
like
it.
he was like wandering around, like kind of
Yep,
like
yep.
aimlessly and stuff like that. Yeah, but basically, Wallace did not want to segregate schools in Alabama, and Kennedy actually executes an executive order sending the Alabama National Guard to physically remove Wallace.
Yep.
Right, and he eventually moved on to he did a lot of other sort of racist ideas and stuff like that. But
He gets
they were
shot, right? Doesn't he get
he gets
shot?
shot. Vivian was able to eventually Vivian Loan and James
Register.
Switz registered, and they were the first two black students at University of Alabama. So again, there was desegregation, but you didn't really get those big ones until a big wave of students until much later on. Going the ongoing civil rights issues from the '60s is really depicted pretty well here.
Yeah, I think like it's an ongoing theme throughout the whole movie is the civil rights issues.
In
And
Vietnam later on,
Vietnam takes such a big chunk of it. This event was known as Stand in a Schoolhouse Door. Governor George Wallace, who's the governor of Alabama, like as you mentioned, he literally said, "No, you're not going in." And Kennedy's like, you have to let them in." And his famous thing was, Wallace's famous thing was segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. So Kennedy's like, "Yeah, buddy, that's not going to happen." So he sends in federal marshals and the National Guard troops, and they basically force General Wallace to move out of the way to allow these two African American students to register. And at that point, supposedly one of them drops a notebook, and Forrest is right there to pick it up and hand it over. But this is known as iconic moment in the struggle for civil rights and racial equality in the United States. So, he goes to college, he wins this award, he supposedly sees JFK. When he's in the White House, because he's in the White House a few times, some people miss it too. While he's washing his hands in the White House, he sees a picture of Marilyn Monroe in the bathroom. I don't know if you caught that. As he's washing his hands.
Instances there.
Yep, and then he's just like, "Oh, and
some
years later, someone killed this nice young man."
Well, actually, I found out like how this, how people will look up the facts and stuff like that and try to like debunk things. So the Collegiate All-American football team was just the one who actually went to the White House. They were that was actually not announced until December 6th, 1963. So he couldn't have been there to meet Kennedy because Kennedy was assassinated November 22nd, 1963.
Yep.
There's nobody could have met in that, capacity. But it's still
Yeah.
just kind of interesting how they do that and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So, because
Very
Kennedy only technically, when I was looking into it, they said Kennedy only two. One, he actually attended an Army Navy football game in '62, and the other one was the fact that he had the University of Alabama team in '62 as well visit. But that's it. There was no actual in National American Football Team meeting with Kennedy. So I thought that was kind of cool. All right, so Kennedy, he gets out of his what do you call it? He gets out of college, and now we have the whole draft going into Vietnam. But you also have in between this is the ping pong diplomacy. Which one? Which one do you have next?
Well, I have military service, right? So the
Yeah,
idea
let's
is
do
you
that.
have in
Okay.
military service, Forrest goes and fights, and he's part of what becomes known as the silent generation, right? Before that, you have the
Yep.
greatest generation. You have the silent generation where they're not in as popular wars, basically. Korea, Vietnam, the whole idea of domino theory and stuff like that. Like it's just not as those wars didn't end as gloriously, I guess you can say, or as clean as World War II, if
Yep.
that's a good way to put it. So, yeah, the United States gets involved. They issue a draft, and you have eventually over 500,000 Americans are drafted, and it was all protests. And you see that later on in the movie as well. It's something that I think a lot of people don't fully understand nowadays is the idea of a draft. And I know, like I was tell the students, like, well, the boys in here, like women can join the military if they want. There's nothing stopping them. But the boys, you have to register for the draft. Like you still have to. That's not like a option. Like I can still go to selectiveservice.gov, put in my social security number,
So
and then
it's
my
no, it's
draft number still
selective.
comes up.
Yeah, selective service
Selective
number.
service, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. My selective service number still comes up. Like it can still, it's just kind of crazy that it's still like in the system like that. But so Forrest goes into the Vietnam. Before he gets there, he does see segregated units, but eventually that does change under Truman. Right, Truman ends segregation in the armed forces because of
Yeah, during
African
the
American
Korean War.
involvement
Yeah.
in World War II. So he ends that, and that's why you actually have. I think you have because of that. It's why how Forrest meets Bubba.
Yep.
So it's even like it's not obvious. It's still like these subtle things that they just kind of show how society is changing and evolving.
Yeah, just the sheer fact that he's in a desegregated unit.
Yeah,
Which
that's what. Yeah.
again, first time that happened was the war prior, the Korean War. So while he's at war, again, he goes through war. The one thing I found that was really, um, so I did a lot of research. Cheap plug again, but I did a lot of research for my book about New Jersey and the Medal of Honor, and I went through so many different Medal of Honor stories. And there is an actual person that won the Medal of Honor that Forrest Gump supposedly won. They call him the real Forrest Gump. And even when they filmed the scene, because they CGI'd Forrest Gump into it, when you have LBJ giving him the Medal of Honor, that was a real person. It was Sammy L. Davis that received the Medal of Honor. And Sammy L. Davis people made fun of him for the longest time because of the fact that his name was Sammy Davis, like the actor and the
Yeah.
singer. So he kind of got a lot of teasing from that. But what winds up happening, his real story. So the real story behind the Forrest Gump. So he was serving as like a cannon guy, Battery C, in Vietnam. He winds up getting attacked. His unit gets attacked by enemy mortars and artillery fire, and then, despite being wounded by shrapnel, right, an exploding mortar around him. He has multiple injuries, including a broken back. He refuses medical evacuation and continues to assist his fellow soldiers, bringing them out of harm's way. And he maintains his position and provides accurate, effective fire support that basically contributes to the defense of his unit. So he does the Forrest Gump action. This is a real person that they just gave it to Forrest Gump. And I almost feel bad that they erased this guy's face and put Forrest Gump's face in the movie, but I guess they needed to,
Well,
make
they're
that
trying to, yeah,
special. Yeah,
spice them,
special.
especially in 1994. That's just like what you got to do to get it going. But I thought was also kind of interesting is during when Forrest is in Vietnam, how they're talking about like Charlie. So you're hearing everything about the Charlie, which is like the Viet Cong and things like that. Also, that Forrest was a tunnel rat, which
Yep.
basically means that he was the ones that was going kind of like head first into these tunnels, underground caverns, basically to find Viet Cong soldiers hiding out, which was incredibly dangerous because you're kind of just crawling around in the dark until you find somebody. Like
Yeah.
fighting in these tunnels and stuff like that. Napalm
Um,
was used big time there.
Yes. Yes. And also, when he's in a hospital recovering from getting shot in the butt, they're watching the TV's on. I don't know if you caught that. And it's Gomer Pyle, which was basically a TV show about a fictional character that was, I mean, for the lack of a better word, slow and kind of dumbwitted in a sense. At that, but just was very courageous and very noble. And if you guys know, you could probably YouTube Gomer Pyle episodes. It was a very popular fictional show that ran in like 1963. And and while that TV's on, that's basically kind of more or less what the character of Forrest Gump is based off of, character wise.
Yeah.
And someone's like, Forrest, shut that thing off. Who watches that crap? It's like, and that's the irony and all that. That's why that was put in there in the first place. And then, so anyway, so he leaves Vietnam, right?
And he
Unless you have
comes
something
home.
else.
And,
Yep.
yeah, no, I
Yep.
would say that, right? Then he comes home and he's just getting, well, he meets LBJ like we talked about, right? And
Yep.
that's, I think LBJ is an interesting person too because he's like domestically, he did actually some like pretty good things. You can talk about civil
Yeah.
rights, like the Great
Yep.
Society, but then he also introduced the draft. Internationally, he was bad, obviously with Vietnam and everything. That's why he decides not to run for re-election after he finishes his first term and part of Kennedy's term. But then when Forrest comes back, that's when he's really being introduced again with Jenny and the counterculture. So he's seen like the beatniks, which is counterculture. Jenny's an example of that. When she's like playing the guitar and stuff. Later on, she's more of a hippie and things of that nature, and all the anti-war protests. And then he actually meets up with the Black Panther Party.
Yes, I have that one. Yep. Yep.
And then he meets up with the Black Panthers, and from there he meets the SDS, which is the Students for a Democratic Society, which was where that I guess Jenny's boyfriend was in. Remember that?
Yeah, there's so much counterculture. So the Vietnam and
Yeah,
the
big time.
anti-Vietnam War movement, and also mixing this the civil rights aspect. The Black Panther Party was initially designed. It was initially actually known and designed for self-defense. So hence it was known as the Black Panther Party for self-defense. And the idea was to advocate for rights and empowerment of Black communities. First of all, they were influenced by teachings of Malcolm X, right? There was some Marxist theory in there. They adapted a very militant stance, which you kind of saw in the movie
In
as
the
well.
movie,
And
yeah.
this idea of like just they were against racial oppression, against systemic rather injustice, and police brutality was their key. But they also addressed issues besides police brutality: the housing, education, employment, military service exemptions for African Americans. They really wanted to help underserved communities. So whenever I teach this, everyone always thinks like Black Panther movement. They think of like the Black Berets, and they have machine guns, but really there are just as much for free breakfast programs for children and health clinics and legal services and educational initiatives. Think of him as like an advocacy for armed self-defense. And he winds up going into one of these Black Panther parties where he beats up a guy from the SDS, as you mentioned,
Yeah, Student for a Democratic Society.
yeah.
Yeah, so then he leaves that, but that just shows again these little tidbits in history that Forrest is becoming part of. It's like later on when he's at New Year's Eve, he's watching the ball drop, and he also see the space landing too during that time.
He does. He does. He sees a space landing at one point on TV, which is a big deal. And then also, since we're sticking with the TV, remember he's on a talk show with Carson, I think. And then, like, you
Johnny
have John
Carson.
Lennon there, Johnny Carson. That's what it
Yes,
was.
John Lennon. Yeah, John Lennon there. Yeah.
And then that's how he inspires Imagine, right? Which is one of the most iconic songs ever written by John Lennon. So he's like talking about people there. Oh, they're nice to each other, and they do this and life and love, and he's like, wow, imagine that. And like you see John Lennon like pondering and like
Yeah, like
and I
kind of
suppose
like
it
a Freudian
inspires him. Yeah,
spark.
Imagine was considered. First of all, it came out during social unrest, political upheaval, ongoing Vietnam War, but it became the anthem for peace and anti-war movement of that era. The Imagine song, which
Oh
is
yeah,
to
big
this
time.
day a very great song, and supposedly inspired by Forrest Gump. So, all right, what do we got? Where are we going to next?
Well, then we have, I would say, probably ping pong diplomacy if I'm
Yeah, that
following
was my next
the
one. Yep.
timeline. And so Forrest becomes a ping pong star, and this is kind of mirroring when Nixon becomes president because the idea of he becomes this ping pong star and then actually goes to China to play ping pong, and that's actually the first time since World War II, right? That you're seeing like
Yep.
Westerners, particularly Americans, having like diplomatic relations with Chinese. So it becomes part of his ping pong diplomacy because Nixon actually visits China. He becomes a sitting president to actually go to China and then uses that to kind of piggyback open door policy, get some more trade there, kind of open up China to the West again.
Yeah. But the actual term of ping pong diplomacy and where it really started, which I think we definitely touched upon this somewhere at one of our other podcasts, because it starts
Yeah.
at the 31st World Tennis Championship, and which was held in Japan in 1971. And at this tournament, as you mentioned, America and China, we do not speak. We have not really had any relations since China became communist in 49, right? And then the subsequent Korean War, like it's a big no-no.
We're not buddies, not good
Exactly.
friends.
Exactly. And at this tournament, American player Glenn Cohen missed his team bus. I remember you telling this story on the last episode we did, God knows when. And he was offered a ride by a Chinese player, Zhuang Zedong. And it was like a simple gesture of goodwill, but it actually led to a brief interaction between Cohen and Zedong. And it was just like, all right, well, they kind of hung out. They gave him a ride to a hotel. They exchanged small
Yeah,
gifts. And then
this
that
kind of shows that
actually
they're human. Yeah.
Exactly. And that encounter received significant media attention and was interpreted kind of as like a positive sign, like, wow, like maybe the two countries can get together. These two ping pong players showed that they could. And shortly thereafter, after this incident, the table tennis teams received invitations from one another. Americans invited the Chinese, Chinese invited the Americans. And in April 1971, the American team traveled to China, and it was the first group of any Americans to visit the country since the Communist Revolution. So one of those people supposedly was obviously Forrest Gump. They did it so well. I think that movie was just done so well. How they like weave these things into it, like it all
Well,
just
so again,
clicked.
it's all part of the novel too, and they just found ways to
It
do it.
all just clicked. All right, so what's the next thing you got on here?
Well, if I'm following, you have the 1970s. I know he talks about you see Jimmy Carter on TV. That's kind of
Yeah,
like women's rights in Title IX. But I guess the other big event happens on December 24th, 1974, which the movie kind of changed. I don't know if that's really wintertime in that time movie, but it's when Hurricane Carmen hit Louisiana. This is when Lieutenant Dan and Forrest are on their shipping boat, and
yep.
basically all the other boats got wiped out from the shore. But since they were out there, they get all the shrimp and basically takes Bubba Gump to a brand new level, like a franchise, which I think there is actually a Bubba Gump franchise today.
There is. I just
Yeah.
walked past it. I was in the city. I was in New York City, and like 2 weeks ago, and I walked past Bubba Gump Shrimp Company, right off Broadway. Hurricane Cameron brought strong winds, heavy rainfall. Ultimately, they said that the destructive winds and torrential rain destroyed the Louisiana, Florida, and Mississippi coasts. So they don't know how many deaths resulted, but they know that there definitely were deaths that resulted from it, and there were mass evacuations that were ordered in the coastal areas ahead of the landfall. But a lot of residents chose to stay, as is often the case, and then there's massive damage done. But that was 74, so that winds up happening
Yeah, that's
74. Well,
before. Yeah, so
we
we skipped a
skipped
big one. Yeah,
Watergate. Yeah, we
Watergate. Yeah,
skipped.
so obviously Watergate, which is kind of probably like one of the more famous events that Forrest kind of stumbles into, right? So basically, you have we did a whole podcast on Watergate.
Like 4 years
Oh,
ago.
yeah, quite some time ago. Basically, when there was bugs inside of bugs, like electronic tampering device inside Democratic headquarters, and in the movie, right, Forrest kind of like stumbles upon, right, he's staying at the Watergate Hotel, and he sees a bunch of flashlights. He's like, oh, someone probably got locked out of the room, so he calls the front desk, and supposedly that's how the people get caught doing this. But the big thing about Watergate is that eventually this scandal, which at the time no one thought was going to be a big deal, winds up ending the
Presidency. Yeah.
Nixon presidency. And really, in American politics, I would always teach my AP Gov students this is kind of the event that like split American politics. You had everything before Watergate and everything after Watergate, because after that is really when people stopped trusting politicians. That argument
True.
was because before that it was kind of like, oh, you can always trust the politicians; they would never lie. The president's not going to lie to you, which obviously presidents did do that way before Watergate. But Watergate's kind of when it becomes like mainstream, you know?
Yeah, and I think the Pentagon Papers dropped 71, so it's like a two punch.
Yeah,
Boom, boom.
yeah. Everything Vietnam, you had Watergate, Nixon resigns. It's just yeah.
So the story, obviously, as you mentioned, supposedly he sees them and he's like, "Oh, I see someone over there in that hotel with flashlights, and I can't sleep." Like, but actually, as you mentioned, this was not initially caught at all. This received very little attention. The break in itself, it was the investigative reporters from the Washington Post, right, Woodward and Bernstein, that really pursued this story and made this into a story, and they're the ones that their reporting uncovered links between Watergate break-in and the Nixon administration. Prior to that, it was like, okay, so there might have been a break-in. Like, it didn't become a big thing until it was made a big thing by these two investigative reporters. So that, again, if you want to listen to the whole story of this, go back in the archives. It's there.
It's there. So I think the next thing that kind of happens is briefly shown. after Hurricane Carmen is the day that Forrest finds out his mother was sick. If you're watching, the news is on, and they're talking about Charles Manson and his followers.
Really? I missed that.
Yes,
What?
that's like a super quick one there. You also see the birth of disco. Jenny is shown in disco clubs using
That is
cocaine
true.
and
Yeah.
heroin. So you're seeing a lot of that counterculture with the drugs, LSD, all of those things. Um, and yeah, so you kind of just seeing these like small little things going on.
And
And
then
then you
Apple
also,
is isn't it Apple? My big one next one is when Lieutenant Dan buys
yeah, so
shares in
then
some fruit company.
Fruit Company, which was Apple, which was the first, and then which was made in 1976. Which think about Apple computers, but that's when it was first founded. Was created at that time and turned a huge profit very quickly. So it was one of those
Yeah,
like
no,
quick things, yeah. And he just
no,
Forrest was like, well, now I don't have to worry about money anymore. That's nice.
yeah, it's crazy, right? And like when you start looking at the Apple release, like I mean, I guess today's generation thinks of Apple as like iPhones, but really, Apple was groundbreaking when it came to personal computers. So '76 Apple One comes out. They actually made Apple One, designed it. Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs designed this in Jobs' parents' garage, right?
Yeah.
And then in '77, they introduced Apple II, which really catapults Apple to prominence. And then Apple II's groundbreaking computer features color graphics, built-in keyboards, so on and so forth. And then in '84, Apple introduces the Macintosh, revolutionizes personal computer featuring graphical user interface, and it has the first mouse, really. And that's around the time when Forrest buys his stock, like on that cusp between Apple II in '77 and Apple Macintosh in
Yeah.
'84. He buys that stock somewhere in between there. So the idea
Imagine
is that,
that.
yeah. So the idea is that like he makes his money when Macintosh is introduced in '84 and he becomes a gazillionaire. He even says that I'm a gazillionaire. But like Macintosh, they said it was first of all commercial success, but the iconic 1984 television commercial, which was supposedly directed by Ridley Scott, like the Oscar-winning director, aired during the Super Bowl and is
hmm
widely regarded as one of the greatest commercials of all time. So now I need to like go out and actually watch
I
this
don't know.
commercial.
I don't know. It's like what makes a great commercial, but yeah, I guess. Well, if it got people to buy the product, I guess it's a big commercial.
Well, yeah, I mean Apple,
Yeah.
and the irony of all this is that Steve Jobs leaves Apple '85 and starts his own company because they get in a fight, which
Oh,
is
it's
crazy.
interesting. He can do that. It's a whole other podcast by itself.
We
So if
should
you're ever
do one.
following the time span, I guess 1977, this is when Forrest decides to just start running, right?
Yes.
And during this, he kind of gets introduced, and when he's doing this, like, why are you running for women's rights? Why are you running for environmental right, animal rights? So you have like they kind of represent that again, like Title IX,
Yep.
environmental rights, which was a new idea back then. Animal rights with PETA, and the whole idea also is you're seeing kind of like the American dream because you have also these companies that supposedly Forrest inspires, like the Smiley Face
That was
brand,
funny.
which
That was
becomes
funny.
very big, and then the
SHIT happens.
SHIT happens brands, which were famous brands in the 70s and early 80s. These were like big deals. People knew they got those references when they were watching those movies. So, yeah, but Forrest inspired them basically. So again, he's just showing these little tidbits of how he's affecting Americana, but it's also showing examples of Americana, like capitalism. Like who would think just with making a smiley face, on a yellow shirt is going to make millions of
Funny.
dollars. You
Yeah.
know what I mean? Or a bumper
No.
sticker that says, SHIT happens.
Yep.
Like you're going to make millions of dollars doing that. That's capitalism.
Crazy. And as the movie comes to a close, kind of on a somber note, a few things. So obviously, I mean, by now, if we haven't spoiled the movie for you, I assume you're listening to this podcast, you've seen the movie. At the end, when he goes back and he meets Little Forrest and Jenny, you have Sesame Street on television. He comes home and he sits in front of TV, Little Forrest, and he watches Sesame Street. And PBS Sesame Street was becoming a thing, '70s, early '80s, to really help working mothers, but really like kids that couldn't afford preschool, to learn those basic things. And that's kind of what's happening here. Jenny is working as a single mother. She is a waitress, and her son comes home, and he doesn't have that additional stuff he might have if if she had money to send him to daycare or something. So he watches public television. He watches Sesame Street,
Like
and
Big
then
Bird.
after that. Right, Big Bird. And after that, you kind of get into the sad part of it, and that is the HIV/AIDS outbreak in the
Which they never
'70s and
actually
'80s.
say she has it, right? They kind of just say it's a virus doctors don't know yet or don't know much about,
Exactly. Yep.
right? But they're kind of just hinting it's HIV virus, which then leads to AIDS. And it's really this marks in 1981 is kind of like the outbreak of the AIDS virus in the mainstream world. It was obviously known in the 70s in certain communities, but it kind of becomes like national news, I guess, in the early 80s.
And it wasn't even known as HIV/AIDS. At first, it was a GRID, right? Which is gay-related immune deficiency, because it primarily happened among gay men in LA, San Francisco, and New York City. So initially, the disease was actually known as gay-related immune deficiency. And then it starts to spread really beyond the United States and other parts of the world, Europe, Africa, Asia, and it winds up changing that it's not just for gay men. And you have the HIV and AIDS. Yeah, she's like sits on a bench with him, and she said, "Yeah, doctors really don't know what it is. It's this new thing." I feel like the filmmakers are definitely alluding to the fact that she's
never
dying
actually
from
say
HIV.
it, but that's what it basically is. So that's really kind of how it ends. You do see Reagan's assassination attempt, I believe, on TV,
right?
During, I think you also see an assassination attempt on Gerald Ford also on TV. But that's where the movie kind of much ends with those things. However, the book, it has a few other things. It deals with Iran Contra. Actually, Forrest actually gets arrested because of Iran Contra. At one point, he's actually in Berlin and he kicks a ball over the Berlin Wall and tries to climb over it to go get it back. And that creates kind of an international incident. So there's some other ones that did happen later on. And what's interesting is that Eric Roth, who wrote the original film in '94, he did plan a sequel. He actually wrote it. So he did write a sequel. Somewhere. So it was going to be even more historical moments when he was raising Forrest Jr. Like the one thing was that Forrest Jr. Would have possibly like had AIDS, right, from Jenny. So like, he had been ostracized from school. He was Forrest was gonna wind up in the back of O.J. Simpson's Bronco.
Really?
During the famous chase. He was supposed to have a dance with Princess Diana at one point in the movie. But then like real life events kind of got in the way. What happened was they wrote the sequel and they turned it in on 9/10/2001.
Oh, wow.
And it was sent to Tom Hanks and the director, and they were all going to talk about it and watch it. And then 9/11 happened. 9/11/2001 took place. And they were just like, basically Tom Hanks said, listen, the movie has no meaning anymore. Like there's no point doing it.
Wow.
So it didn't happen. And they said it's never going to happen. There's no point in making the movie anymore. So
I don't think they should. I mean, leave it the way it is.
Well, they're saying too, a lot of those things probably wouldn't hold up as much like in modern day and stuff like that. But the book was very different. I'm not going to get into it, but the book was a bit different than the movie. Forrest is not the sympathetic character, I believe, in the book as he was in the movie. And there is a sequel to the first book also. I don't think Jenny doesn't die either. I don't think.
Yeah, and I don't think they wind up together.
No, she like kicks him. Yeah.
But also, movie-wise, they said that it won a Best Picture Oscar, but it went against Shawshank Redemption. And people say that so Hollywood Reporter, like 2015, winds up polling a bunch of Academy members, asking them if they could revote and like any controversial decisions in the past, and that one comes in first. That if people that were around in '94 that voted for Best Picture, in retrospect, would have given it to Shawshank Redemption.
Well, I think Forrest Gump was such a cultural phenomenon. Yeah. Mama says stupid is stupid. Like those things, life is like a box of chocolates. They become part of Americana. Like how many movies are those parodied in? Like after that fact for years. And even now, if you say those things, people are going to know, oh, yeah, that's Forrest Gump. You mentioned Forrest Gump. Like I said, even students are like, oh, yeah, I love that movie. Or when are we going to watch Forrest Gump? So
which is crazy, right? And we're talking about kids that were born in like 2007. And they're like, I love Forrest Gump.
Yeah, they like Forrest Gump. So it's just one of those things. So hopefully we're able to explain some of the historical background of some of the events that take place in that movie. And, again, most of these things you can check in our archives, too. We probably did podcasts on good 90% of what we just talked about.
Absolutely. And hopefully this will inspire you guys to go and watch the movie again, because it really, truly is a great movie. And if you haven't seen it in a while, watch it. And if not, you could also just go on Spotify or something and listen to the soundtrack, because that's something that could have a podcast in itself. It's
absolutely.
It's an amazing soundtrack. So thank you so much, guys, as always, for tuning in to listen to our podcast. We greatly appreciate it. If you need to find us, you can find us at www.historyteacherstalkingpodcast.com. We are there to answer any of your questions. And I guess until next week, enjoy, everybody.
Stay safe, everybody.
I hope everyone enjoyed our podcast, and if you would like to email us, you can do so at historyteacherspodcast@gmail.com.
Tires matter. They're the only part of your vehicle that touches the road. Tread confidently with new tires from Tire Rack. Whether you're looking for expert recommendations or know exactly what you want, Tire Rack makes it easy. Fast, free shipping, free road hazard protection, convenient installation options, and the best selection of Yokohama tires. Go to TireRack.com to see their Yokohama test results, tire ratings, and reviews, and be sure to check out all the special offers. TireRack.com, the way tire buying should be.